Our next speaker, Dallas Smith, is the president and founder of the Nunwakaulis Council, which is comprised of 7 First Nations. Nunwakaulis means a place we go to find agreement. And the Nunwakaulis First Nations have shown leadership and vision in working with government to create new economic opportunities within their traditional territories. Please join me in welcoming Dallas Smith to talk about culture and collaboration.
Gaelic Asla gigamek gachi nu kwanala. Gaelic Asla hakwatnis hamakla hegitmatla. There's nothing like starting off your introductory comments by alienating 100% of the room that you're speaking to. My name's Dallas Smith. I'm the president and founder of Nunwakaulis Council. We're a First Nations organization that's come together. It's an organization we built ourselves to deal with our land and resource management planning issues. It's something that's evolved since, late 1996. A little bit about myself. My chief's name is Wolkane Gaaxtalas. It means the wished for one who brings us peace. It's a little bit prophetic, being the role that I play with my people. It wasn't planned to be that way, but that's just the way it's worked out. In my language, I thank the First Nations people of this territory who've allowed me safe passage and have looked after me while I've been here. Really, it's a form of respect that First Nations cultures still use. We honor the people whose territories we're in, and we don't forget that we're in somebody else's land when we're doing things, when we leave our home territories. And so we give thanks to those people for looking after us and looking after our well-being while we're there. And I think that's something that we take for granted a little bit in this day and age of business and economy and all those things. We forget about the grassroots of just common decency and human respect. I see my friend Dan Johnson's here today, and he's one of the ones who sort of taught me. I used to think a lot of things were Indian issues or white people issues, and he's helped me understand that most of it's just human nature. And if you approach things from that angle, you don't really get uptight and bent out of shape, and it makes discussions and collaborations a lot more easier. So I've got a presentation that I've put together here to just explain our journey through the Great Bear Rainforest and how we developed collaborative relationships with the user groups within our territory. The original land use planning process began in 1997, and it was known as the War in the Woods. We had seen Clayoquot Sound happen on southern Vancouver Island, where the environmentalists started blocking roads and using First Nations as allies to stop the forest companies from some of the havoc that they were wreaking in some of those pristine watersheds. And it grew to the Central Coast. The province realized that they needed to do some stakeholder land use planning processes to really get people sitting at the table and getting some of the interest put on for discussion. First Nations were hesitant to join that table. This is before Delgamuuk. This is before Aboriginal rights and title were really brought into the discussion. We had seen the previous land use planning process, the CORE, the Commission on Resources Environment, and we sat on the sidelines and watched that process make designations. They put protected areas in place, they put operating areas in place, and this was all done without our consent or without our participation in the process. So when the province decided to go forward with further land use planning processes, our chiefs decided that we had to engage that table. We were reluctant, but we went there more as a safeguard of our territories, and it wasn't very collaborative. I see Norm here was actually the facilitator at the first LRMP process, where we had 80 different stakeholder groups just jammed into a room, and the province said, hey, you guys got 2 years, figure it out. And it was all just interest-based discussions. It really wasn't very productive. We were lucky because we got to use the opportunity as a learning experience to learn that we had ideas and I guess ideas for how our territory were to be managed, but we had no idea how many other groups had interest in our territory. We didn't know what NGOs were. We didn't know really the role that industry played and all the investment that they had in our territories. So the chief said, show up at the table and just make sure nobody's doing anything that they shouldn't be doing in our territories. The treaty process started in 1994, and we thought this was where all these jurisdiction discussions were going to happen. The treaty process has been in existence for 20 years now, and I think there's 6 treaties in British Columbia out of the 200 bands are there. So that's a failing process that put a little bit more pressure on the land use planning process that we were engaged in. The first iteration of the land use planning process lasted about 3 years, and it was under the NDP government. There wasn't really a lot of political leadership shown in it. It was simply managing us as opposed to working with us. And that's all the stakeholders across the board: industry, ANGOs, recreation users, et cetera, et cetera. We really had a problem with all the interest in finding out about these, and it was really hard to sit at that table and participate, even though government says, we'll work with you as government to government, but to just sit here and talk about all these ideas that people had for our territories without getting our consent was just really frustrating. And it left us very adversarial at the table. And it wasn't very productive at all. The 3 years really led to nothing except some relationship building outside of the table. 2000, we got a new government comes into place, the Liberals come into power and take another stab at land use planning. It wasn't for the social justice issues that we wanted it to be about. It was because they needed the certainty. They couldn't handle the international campaigns that were devastating the BC forest industry. They needed to get everybody in the room and come to some kind of peace agreement to sit down and use the planning process as a foundation for everybody to get their issues on the table. In hindsight, we have to really take our hats off to the environmental organizations because they brought the awareness to the world of the issues that we are facing in our territories with the unsafe logging practices that were going on, with the lack of benefits that were being achieved by the communities in the region that were being developed. But in the beginning, it was a very rocky relationship between First Nations and ANGOs. I remember personally kicking Greenpeace out of our territory forever. We've invited them back since, but that's just the way it went. It was like, you can't come in and cause these problems in our territories while we're trying to solve our own problems. If you're not going to work with us, kindly please leave our territory. And that's where we realized that we really had to get involved with everybody. We had to build these relationships and start to understand what their interests were in our territory so we could share what our interests were and we could work together and try to find a path forward. So we all agreed to sit down at the table. Government, industries, and ANGOs, they each threw $1 million into what was called the Coast Information Team. That was to come up with independent, my air quotes, I haven't got to use air quotes in a long time. Sorry, these lights get turned down a little bit. This is really distracting me. The Coast Information Team. Each of the parties threw $1 million in, and we were supposed to find independent science. But what we learned as First Nations was he who paid the piper picked the tune. We heard a lot of comments at that independent science panel that my money isn't going to pay for that scientist to do this work. Well, my $1 million isn't going to pay for this, and it was really very unproductive. At the end of the day, we spent the $3 million, and we sort of had a common understanding of what needed to go into the planning process from a scientific point of view, but we still didn't have an understanding of what the cultural process had to be. How do we achieve something called ecosystem-based management, which is achieving high levels of ecological integrity and high levels of human well-being while keeping a viable economy, resource-based economy? So we all had our own interpretations of what that was to be. Government to government. First Nations really, as I've been saying, had a lot of troubles of not being able to deal with those jurisdiction issues at the table. And there was a good year and a half of where we just did everything we could to slow down the process and really stop it because we weren't having those jurisdiction issues dealt with. So finally, after some leadership by the Liberal government, they came and committed to us that whatever comes out of this plan, we will go through at a government-to-government basis after the planning process has been done. So after we've taken into consideration of all the stakeholders and interest groups in the territory, we'll sit down as governments and work through this plan together. And that gave us enough confidence that we could not fight that jurisdiction. We wouldn't filibuster anymore and let the stakeholders do the planning that they needed to be done because we had that confidence that we were going to be able to deal with it at a government-to-government level. And even went as far as to let us co-chair the process, which was a big step optically for First Nations. After Delgamuukw, everybody was worried about consultation, but nobody had really done any relationship building. And we have to give a lot of credit to Premier Gordon Campbell for his interest in starting the new relationship between British Columbia and First Nations. I still don't know why he did it, but it gave us the opportunity to engage it. Again, we were looking for social justice, but I think the Liberal government was smart enough to realize that they needed First Nations certainty for industry to be able to continue to invest in British Columbia. And that was really the impetus of the new relationship. While it wasn't the ideal setting to do it, it was something. The state of our communities wasn't getting any better. The social issues weren't getting any better. And we had to sort of swallow a little bit of pride and just say, okay, we'll engage you at that level if that's how you want to do it. But we got smarter about it. We kissed and made up with the environmental organizations, and we told them what our dreams and aspirations were for our territories and used them to start help lobbying for that balance between ecological integrity and human well-being while still trying to find that viable economy. The Great Bear Rainforest. The term still annoys me to this day, even though I'm one of the architects of the Great Bear Rainforest deals. It's annoying to First Nations people that the Great Bear, which is the spirit bear, the Commodity bear, which is the provincial animal of British Columbia, that's what brought the awareness to the issues that we were facing. And so it was very frustrating to our communities to explain that there's this great white bear that has been made the priority of this planning process. It's not the social justice issues that we're facing. It's not the lack of capacity that we're facing in our communities, but it's this little white bear. And that was just really tough to overcome. And like I said, to this day, it still sort of bugs me a little bit, just how it's categorized as the Great Bear Rainforest. But we collectively agreed between all the parties to adopt ecosystem-based management. While we had different interpretations on it, we all had a same principle understanding of what it was to lead to at the end of the day. I mean, we understand what ecosystem-based management means, but implementing it means something a little bit different to each of us. And that's one of the growing processes that we have going forward, and we still have the relationship where we have a lot of these issues that we discuss about implementation. What is a priority? How does this piece fit to the next piece? When is the next review period? How much should we keep tinkering with it? It's sort of like a decent marriage. We all know that it's not good to be out of it, but sometimes we're like, why are we doing this? But one of the interesting things we've learned about the truly collaborative nature of it is we've had people who've traded teams. We've had Angos who've come to work for First Nations. We've had Angos who've gone to work for the environment. We've had industry guys who switched over and gone to work for the Angos. So it's sort of a little bit like the CFL. We all keep trading our quarterbacks and our good players amongst each other. So that gives us some hope that we're all still heading in the right direction. We coined the phrase Wilamola, which is a Kwagyouth word for if we're not paddling in the same direction, we'll never get there. And that's sort of the approach we take to collaboration in the Great Bear Rainforest. February 6, 2007, we stood up and told the world the war in the woods is over. The limelight was amazing for First Nations communities to understand that Europe was interested in what we're doing. South America was interested in what we're doing. It was just incomprehensible for us to understand that all these groups had an interest in how we were managing our territories and how we were working with the peoples who worked within our territories. It was very eye-opening for us, and it helped us learn how to be more strategic. We started to, I don't want to scare people, but we started to think like Angos a little bit more. We started to use strategic relationships to help us achieve some of the issues that we needed to achieve in our territories. We started the G2G process after we announced that the war in the woods was over. We had all these protected areas that had been recommended by the stakeholder table, but we weren't happy with how protected areas were in our territories. They alienated our access to resources. You all hear the story of, the grandmother who gets arrested for picking blueberries in her own territory. Those sorts of things were happening from existing parks and protected areas in our territory. So we told the province, we agree there needs to be protection of these vital resources, but the mechanism you're using is unacceptable to us. And the province, over some time, sat down and jointly worked with us on developing some legislation that specifically acknowledged our Aboriginal rights and title within those conservancy areas. And we went forward and introduced, we were actually the first First Nations groups to stand in the House during the introduction of that legislation. And we see that legislation being used all over the province now. It's sort of been a template that's used that brings Aboriginal rights and title into the legislation to help move that government-to-government relationship forward. Took us about 2 years in government to government to dot all the I's and cross all the T's and get something that we could actually stand up and go forward with. But during that time, we were learning. We were working with the forest companies. We were working with the environmentalists. We started to understand everything that was going on in our territory and understand the capacity needs that we needed to effectively manage our territories. So as a result of that collaboration, relationships and synergies started to develop. We said we need more own source revenue in our communities. The environmentalists took that to heart and said, for these protected areas, we can work with the philanthropic community and develop an economic development fund that will help environmentally sustainable economic development practices of First Nations into the future. And we developed a $120 million fund, which I know in the energy sector is just peanuts, but in the coast, $120 million seemed like a lot of money at the time. It was $60 million was raised by the private foundation sector, and $60 million was brought to the table by government. And that process is still in place, and it helps 27 different First Nations with environmentally appropriate economic development activities, mostly around guardian and watchman, having our people actually out in the territories to help manage and safeguard some of our cultural concerns and artifacts. And it also shed light on the horrible conditions that existed in our reserves. We talk about human well-being. What does that mean? Does it mean we all drive a $60,000 car? Does it mean we all have all the channels on the cable package? Or does it mean a community or a society within itself has the ability to practice their cultures and traditions and continue to do that without running out of deer or without running out of fish or those certain things? And so that's been part of the battle going forward, is trying to understand what does human well-being mean and how do we achieve the high levels of human well-being in a place where there's third world conditions. We thought that there was one answer that was going to sort of sort it all out, and we've had to learn over the years through our collaborations that you have to sort of do it one step at a time. It's like there's been a mudslide that's come over all of our territories, and the only way that we can fix it is one shovel load at a time to make sure that we're not wrecking anything else as we go forward. And we've learned that we have to open ourselves up to those partnerships because of the lack of capacity that we have in our communities to achieve these things. And so it's been really eye-opening for our communities to learn about the various opportunities that they have. In my generation, when I went to school, if you went to university, you either had to be a lawyer or a doctor. And now we've got our kids becoming RP bios, RP foresters, engineers, all those sorts of opportunities that'll give them the ability to work in their territories and work in their homelands. And with all due respect to this crowd, don't have to come to the oil patch to earn a decent living. They can still stay there and contribute to that community well-being. During 10 years of G2G During 10 years of G2G, personal relationships were developed that really helped the policy barriers get unbuilt. I see Steve Carr's on the agenda for later this afternoon, and other people who, while they're in lower level roles, we sort of all grew together. And as they got promoted, we were able to promote our ideas and our solutions going forward. And it was really only over personal relationships where we had the comfortable atmosphere to start sharing some of our issues and some of our concerns, and it was more of a person-to-person thing as opposed to a First Nations to government thing. And it was over, glasses of wine and some good food where we were able to really get to know each other and understand that we all have positions we need to defend, but if we don't put our interests on the table, we're not going to be able to defend our positions very well. And it was really over the evolution of people starting to get promoted and put in places to make more founded decisions because of the relationships that they had built with First Nations leaders and communities that made it a little bit less scary. You talk about policy change. Nobody wants change, but we all agree things need to be different. And that's really been part of the collaborative process, is us coming together, understanding what changes need to be made, how they can be made without really upsetting the apple cart too much and making people afraid of change and going forward. We've used creative thinking outside of the box to tackle jurisdiction issues around joint decision-making and revenue sharing processes. The province is in a tough position because there's 203 First Nations in British Columbia, and it's really the federal government who has the responsibility for that. But because it's the Crown that develops the provincial Crown that develops the natural resources, there's a bit of a vacuum there that needs to be fixed. And so we've learned to work collaboratively with the province and start to work on the federal government now, which is a bit of a tough road to hoe right now. But because we've had that relationship, we're not afraid of it. We're not afraid of failing, because we know that someone's going to be there to back you up to keep moving forward. We know that there's going to be another election where there's opportunities for change and to bring those people forward and bring more people into the collaborative process to understand the issues that we're facing. It's tough when Ottawa manages you from 3,000 miles away and you don't have that access to deal with them face to face to talk about the issues that face your community. So we have to use strategic relationships with the Angos and with the provincial government to get those issues brought into the forefront. I like to say that our communities can't see the progress that we've made over the years. Us as leaders who have been involved on a day-to-day basis, after we've been able to step back, can see how much the world has changed in the last 10 years in our territories. But the community can't see that, and there's some frustration leading to that. We all heard about the Idle No More uprise that was happening over the last 18 months. That's disgruntled youth who can't see the path forward. And that's also showed holes in First Nations leadership. We've seen First Nations leaders have to pick up their game a little bit, and that's one of the other things I credit the environmental movement for, is making us pick up our game and become more self-aware that while we do have a lot of these problems that we face in our communities, we need to look inside ourselves to be able to fix them and be comfortable to ask for help to do that sort of thing. And it's just a new way of thinking that's developing in our territories now. And I'm happy to say that we've got kids coming home every year with master's degrees looking to apply that knowledge that they've gained from the outside world to help their communities become better places to live. Tools. I mean, we've been in this process for 15 years now. Maybe closer to 20 years now, I guess, with the first 3 years that didn't work too well. And we're wondering, what do we have going for it? We have a land use plan that sits on a shelf and we all pull out every 3 years and look at it and make sure everybody's abiding by it. But what tools do we have to actually make a difference in our territories? We were able to develop something called the Strategic Engagement Agreement. It was developed to deal with consultation issues in the use of, air quotes again, Crown land. We still have that jurisdiction issue in British Columbia, but we've understood that we need that land use certainty. We need that vision of certainty for us to be able to prosper economically. And so we've had to put some of the jurisdiction stuff aside and continue to work collaborative. Don't get me wrong, there's still issues to deal with and people are dealing with it. Unfortunately, it's the courts where most of that is ending up. But because of the tools that we've developed, when the judge tells us to go back and work it out, we're going to have these tools to apply, things like strategic engagement agreements. Our strategic engagement agreement was the first one in British Columbia, and now we've seen 50 of them signed in British Columbia. So it is progress, it is steps that are going forward. And what the strategic engagement agreement provides for is an ongoing relationship structured at the technical, and apparently I can't spell anymore, bureaucratic and political levels. In the old days, our chiefs, they're very effective leaders, they're very elegant, they could make a speech to a political leader, but because we didn't progress the issue up the provincial system, we simply just got managed. Oh, chief, that's a very important issue to me and my government, and we're going to fix that for you, and then you don't see him for 6 months again. So we had to learn to structure our relationship to keep everybody accountable. So we've developed something that exists at the technical level. The technicians on both sides go over the issues. What they can't come to agreement on gets punted up to the next level. At the bureaucratic level, the managers start to look at it and say, okay, this is what our policy says. This is what you're trying to achieve. Where's some middle ground? And then we'll go to the political level with solutions that have worked its way through the government system. And we found that to be a much more effective way of working with government. So by the time myself and the minister, the chiefs and the minister sit down, both of our respective staffs have given us the options going forward, and we actually have a progressive discussion as opposed to manage each other. I'll pound the table and they'll tell me, yes, I'm concerned about that too. And now change actually happens. It takes a bit of work and effort and capacity. It's unfortunate that Out of the, probably $30 million that has been spent in the Great Bear Rainforest, it took us till the planning process was done to actually figure out how to move some of these issues forward, but we learned those lessons. We've kept the communications up in progress. We're actually in the process of negotiating MOUs with both the Coast Forest Products Association and RSP, the Rainforest Solutions, the conglomerate of environmentalists, where we're going to have MOUs that are going to keep us in a relationship going forward to make sure that all this stuff gets implemented in the principles that it was negotiated in. So a little bit more of the summary as I start to wrap this up. The relationships continue to grow. It isn't a perfect system, but it's working. We're tweaking it, we're enhancing it and evolving it. I think the biggest thing that kills it right now is turnover inside the provincial government. You're constantly having to train new bureaucrats on why we built this system, why it's up and running, and why we need to continue to keep using it. Every time there's a cabinet shuffle, it sets us back 6 months in the dialogues that we're having. Every time there's a deputy minister shuffle, it sets us back probably 8 months in what's happening. In the time since Premier Campbell's resigned and Premier Clark's taken over, we've had another vacuum of just lack of progression on some of these fundamental issues that we worked so hard for over the last number of years. And we hope that Premier Clark starts to understand, for her dreams of Enbridge and some of these other things to happen, she needs to finish off this relationship with First Nations. This provincial government right now is trading on a relationship that isn't complete yet. And it's up to all of us to continue to work together to remind them that this relationship needs to be sought through so that all British Columbians are going to be able to benefit from sustainable resource development in British Columbia. On our side of the fence, it's helped us understand how we need to manage our territories. What does it actually take? I mean, we've declared our sovereignty. We are sovereign peoples, but we only have limited capacity to demonstrate that. So what can we do to learn and fill those capacity needs? We've structured relationships with institutions of higher learning now. We have a relationship with the Sauder School of Business at UBC that's helped us with studies and understanding of how we can build our own source revenue and what is the most efficient way for us to build an effective governance system that manages our territory with the principles that our elders and chiefs have put in front of us. The balance that it takes to keep those relationships going, we have 7 First Nations in my tribal council right now. We have up to 10 at times, and we've been down to 6 at times. So there's always new chiefs and councils. We go through elections every 2 years in First Nations community, and all of you in this industry know that 2 years, it takes more than that to build anything that's going to work going into the future. So we've had to manage the changeover. Some of the overlaps that have been introduced to our territories have caused us concern. There's lines that have been created all over our maps that we didn't create, that we have to learn and understand before we can erase them and figure out how to go forward. One of my chiefs told me that, going forward without any balance is just a pathway to destruction. And so the work that we have to do to balance all these issues going forward is always a process. It's always something that needs to be managed. We do need more capacity, but we need to build that capacity so it's long-term and sustainable. It's funny how much we bitch and moan about government and government policies, and then when we start to develop our own internal governance system, we seem to keep mirroring what the provincial governments are doing. There's a bit of irony there that's a little bit frustrating at times. But I think one of the greatest things I learned about this was, like I was saying in my introductory comments, it all relates to human nature, your ability to look someone in the eye, have that empathy, have that understanding, and be able to build that relationship so people aren't afraid to work with you. I'm not afraid to share my concerns anymore. Norman's probably thinking, wow, this isn't the guy who used to tell me to shut up and get out of my territory and all those things on how we approach business in the old days. And you've seen that development. It's unfortunate that National Chief Atleo had to resign over this education package, but the problem that we face now is we're accountable for our decisions going forward. And most of the chiefs in Canada weren't comfortable with being accountable on that education package. So the national chief had to resign because he thought it was the right step forward, but he didn't have the support. There was still that fear out there that we were going to have to do this ourselves, and we weren't going to have anybody to blame if we fell short. And that's not collaborative. So that's something that the AFN is going under some restructuring right now, so we can learn how to move these efforts forward a little bit more collaboratively and not be like the old days where government would throw something in the middle and we'd all just fight like cats and dogs over it. So it's nice to see these things developing, and the ability that our new leaders, our new emerging leaders have in understanding sort of non-native culture and native culture, and they're able to bridge a lot of those gaps that exist. I was fortunate enough that my mother didn't want me to grow up on the reserve because the education standards were just too subpar. So she moved me to White Rock, which is a suburb of Vancouver, and I was able to grow up there, and I didn't understand what being an Indian meant. It wasn't until 1991 when Kevin Costner made Dances with Wolves that it was cool to be an Indian. I didn't realize the racism that I went through growing up in a non-native community, being a fairly light-skinned native. That's why I got to wear these Indian shirts so people know that I'm an Indian. But I didn't realize the racisms and prejudice that existed. I mean, they're getting worked out now with anti-bullying and all those sorts of things. So there is that evolvement, and people are using our culture as a basis of going forward because it has that respect and understanding for each other. I think one of the other lessons that we need to remember going forward is it's always a living process. Relationship building and collaboration, it never ends because you always have the next hill to get over, and you need that support from everybody involved in that discussion to continue to go forward. I'm going to apologize now because my last slide didn't make it through a formatting error of mine this morning. But I'd like to now maybe open the floor up for questions, discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Dallas, for sharing your story on the creative and fresh thinking that it takes to start relationships and then the perseverance that you need to keep building them. We are going to have some questions. I would ask you to be patient with Celeste because I have stolen one of the wireless mics. So she only has one. It might take her a couple seconds to get over to you, but we'll get to as many questions as we can. So could I just have the lights up a little bit so I can see the audience? Well, maybe Celeste as well, if you could see somebody. Oh, perfect, thank you. Okay, so who has any questions?
Hi, you talked about the ecosystem-based management, and I understand that you felt that people had different definitions of what that meant, I think is what you were talking about. So I just wondered, when you started the development of that system, or of the management system, did you start with a common set of principles that you agreed to with the groups or the stakeholders that were involved in that management system development?
I think we did. Some of the principles were based just more about transparency and trust building. We even while we went through the process of developing the definition of how ecosystem-based management was going to be applied in our territories, we still didn't really believe it ourselves. It wasn't until we actually, as First Nations, went back home and tried to explain it, and our people said, well, that's how we've been managing our territory for thousands of years. You know, in the northern Vancouver Island area, there's 7,000 First Nations people now, but a short 150 years ago, there was 200,000 First Nations people in that area, and we were able to have a sustainable, thriving economy, culture, and society that existed. And those are some of the principles that we brought back to ecosystem-based management. And I mean, we mask it around a lot of scientific data and things like that, but at the end of the day, it's as simple as just having that balance, understanding what you take out needs to be put back in somewhere else. And those are sort of the principles that we used going forward. It was unfortunate, some of the politics that got played with the scientists that we brought in. I've learned myself that there's no such thing as independent science, because something has to drive you to find that outcome that you're doing, and whether you have personal biases, human biases, or intellectual biases, there's always some kind of bias that brings you to get to the point that you're at. And that's not a bad thing, but you need to understand how to put that on the table and be able to share that view, but open yourself up to be able to hear other points of view that still come from the scientific community. But again, that was one of the lessons lessons we learned going forward, that we just spent the $3 million because that's what we thought we had to do. We didn't put enough thought into what we were trying to achieve and how the outcomes would be used. And so that's a lesson going forward, is maybe we should have worked more on the founding principles that we all would have collectively understood and gone forward, and it would have saved a lot of heartache, but also it would have kept Dan a little bit less busy because we wouldn't have been arguing as much as we have the last 10 years.
Great, thanks. So Dan, do you have a question? Sure. Okay. Wait for Celeste, she's on her way.
Probably Dallas's worst night. Dallas, what I'm interested in, I haven't actually asked you this question before, but in the early days, what was it that you found most fearful about the prospect of collaborating with either the provincial government or stakeholders? And was there a moment where all of a sudden you realized that there was an opportunity there? Was there a pivotal moment that sort of changed your perspective in that regard?
I think my biggest fear was just more alienation. I talked about how nobody really likes change, but over the years of First Nations people and colonialization, nothing's ever really changed for the betterment of First Nations people. And so while we agreed what was existing didn't work, we were more afraid of what was going to come down the pipe. But I guess the moment where I had the epiphany, or the moment of clarity, was probably when I realized that you weren't a jerk. And I say that a little bit in jest. I say that a little bit in jest because Dan, as some of you may or may not know, played a very pivotal role in the Great Bear Rainforest, and we saw him as an outsider coming in to try get us to live with some conditions that we weren't ready to do. And it wasn't until you sat me down with a couple people informally and we had that discussion, okay, what do we want to achieve? Dallas, what are your concerns? Share that with the environmentalists who are at the table right now. Let's have that discussion. And the fact that they were able to ask more questions and they were interested in what I wanted to achieve really shed some light on the fact that people are supporting the movement for First Nations in this country. They just don't know how to do it, and they need someone to help them do that. And I think that's one of the great legacies of the Great Bear Rainforest, is the fact that so many of us have these ongoing relationships. And I just realized Sephora is sitting right beside you, where, we used to have it out in the early days now, and now when we have issues, we call Sephora up when we need support on clean air initiatives that we're working on and different things. So the fact that we were able to let go to help more come in, I think, was sort of the epiphany and the moving moment where we realized that this was the crucial opportunity that we needed to make that successful change. And you're not a jerk.
Great, thanks.
Dallas, you I think touched on this maybe a little bit, but this question of science, and we've got Western science and we've got traditional knowledge, and it's always been a bit of a challenge to try and bridge the gap that exists between those. And I wondered if you could comment on that and how you feel you've been able to do that in your situation.
Definitely, that's a growing process, and that's one of the issues that we're facing right now, is how do we take that traditional ecological knowledge and apply it in today's day of Western science or European science, or however you want to put it. Non-native science, I guess, is probably the term that I'd feel most comfortable using. And again, it goes to that fear of change. We have all of our information. We know where all of our cultural sites are. We know where our sacred sites are. But we're so afraid of sharing that knowledge because it's going to get taken and twisted and used against us in various ways, from grave robbing to just stopping some of our own economic interests. And so that's sort of the relationship building we're doing with our communities, is saying, what's the purpose of us gathering this information if we're not going to share it and use it to educate the outside world, whether that be through science, whether that be through policy, or whether that be simply just through personal engagement and development. But there's still a lot of fear with the old people that they don't want these sites put on a map, and they don't want some of our traditions and practices sort of bastardized isn't the right word, but colonization has just done so much to upset our apple cart on how our communities lead our own communities internally. The fact that dollars are the bottom line for decision making is just something that our culture can't really comprehend and work with yet. And so that's part of the obstacle going forward, is just trying to figure out how to take a cash-based bottom line economy and apply that with what's right for the community at the end of the day. And I'm glad that we have some of these kids who've achieved education and learned more about Western science, because they're the ones who are going to help us integrate traditional ecological knowledge into those processes going forward. It's, you know, that's going to be the fundamental problem that we have, is we need to manage our territories in customs with our practices and traditions, but at the same time, we need dollars to build own source revenues and those sorts of things. So eventually, those paths need to merge. We're trying to keep them separate right now, but for us to be successful as a culture and for our culture and society to evolve as First Nations people, those paths have to get integrated.
Sorry. Thanks for your comments, Dallas. Were all the stages in this 10-year journey necessary, like the big stages? And I guess my related question is there anything you think people could have done differently to avoid the major hurdles?
Because the collaborations that we did in the Great Bear Rainforest were so new, I don't really think we could have done anything differently at time. We had to have the boiling points that we had to have. We had to have that fear of the international campaign against BC wood products to keep the companies at the table, to keep us just from trying to use that write-a-check mentality to fix it. We realized that we opened a can of worms and we had to see it all the way through. And it's unfortunate that it took 12 years, but you know, I talk to people sort of as we're done, and we sort of say, you know, what could we have done differently? And we really can't pinpoint one thing we could have done differently, except for the money that we spent. We could have spent it. We should have put more thought into it before we started spending it, I guess, is the one thing that I'd say we should have done differently. We all agreed science needed to be done, but we didn't agree what science needed to be done, and we didn't agree how it was going to be implemented. But we did the science beforehand anyway, and then we sort of got stuck with some pieces that, you know, because we paid for the development of it, it had to be what we worked with, and it just wasn't built properly. So maybe some more collaboration. And it's really funny, though I keep using the word collaboration, because at any one time during the 10-year journey, I never really felt it was a collaborative process. It wasn't until I stepped back and saw how the rest of the world was viewing it that was, wow, this is a pretty special thing that we got going here. And it's being copied in various parts of the world. We participated in the United Nations Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and the work that we did in the Great Bear Rainforest was more complicated than work was being done between all the countries in the Himalayas and some of the work that they're doing in there. So it was really just eye-opening to what had to go into protecting this beautiful piece of land that we call home.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and Celeste has somebody earmarked over there.
Thank you. I've really been enjoying your talk, Dallas. Now, one of the issues with CASA is we're a provincial organization of multi-stakeholders, and in engaging First Nations, what happens is they're very site-based, and because each First Nation is a particular location, they can't speak for the rest of the group provincially. Do you have any ideas on a path forward for us for engaging them in a meaningful way that will bring them all to the table somehow?
I mean, the fact that you guys are doing what you're doing and trying to open up that opportunity to engage First Nations is definitely the step in the right direction. It's going to take patience. One of the problems that we had internally is there's 15 nations that speak my language. We could never get all 15 into the canoe at the same time. There was always someone who wanted to take their ball and go home. And maybe that goes back to Dan's question about when was some of the epiphany. We realized that we didn't need everybody. Someone had to take that journey and go forward. And I mean, once you get one in the door, then more start coming trickling in. Unfortunately, that's based on fear that someone might be getting something that they're not getting, but at least it gets them in the door and the opportunity to start that dialogue. But I mean, my recommendation beyond hiring someone like myself to go and do some work with each of those communities would be to just keep trying. You got to just keep that correspondence going. You follow up the correspondence with offers of personal visitation. You got to go to each of those communities because you have to respect their autonomy, but you have to help them come to the understanding that it's a regional issue, that everybody needs to have their voice heard in that. And it'll be up to them to resurrect some kind of process where they can have First Nations engagement into this, but you're not going to have another 60 people in the room, because you get too many people in the room, obviously things are just unworkable. And I think that was part of the problem that Norm had in the first years of the table. When the Liberals came in, we restructured the table to not everybody who wanted to be there, but to a sectoral model where people worked within their sectors, and then their sector came to the table with their sector wishes. And I think that's something that you need to do, is get some regional relationships working, and then eventually people will see the path forward on how to engage this for their communities.
Ruth, that was a great question, and thank you very much for your insights on that. I think it gives us some food for thought at CASA.